Everybody, and welcome back to another lecture in our Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Kara Larson, and I'm a graduate student at UMA and one of the co-organizers of our Brown Bags. I am very pleased to introduce to you today today's speaker, Dr. Zachary Thomas. Dr. Thomas earned his PhD in 2019 from Macquarie University. His dissertation was entitled A Patrimonial Model of the United Monarchy of Ancient Israel. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Sonia Nadler Institute of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, working on the project Complexity Without Monumentality, Rethinking Nomads of the Biblical Period. And he is an associate postdoctoral fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. Today, he will be giving a talk entitled An Emic Anthropological Approach to the Polities of the Early Iron Age Southern Levant. I will let you take it away.
Okay, let me start by saying thank you to Kara and the staff of the museum for organizing this and inviting me to come and give this lecture. Let me share my screen here. Oh, all right, I think you should be able to see my PowerPoint now. Yep. Okay. Okay. So the presentation I'm going to give to you today is going to be sort of in two parts because my research in the last few years has migrated a bit from sort of Israel to one of Israel's neighboring polities in the Iron Age, Edom, and then back to Israel. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about an anthropological approach to political structure in the early Iron Age, in the case of Israel, which is what I did in my PhD, as Kara told you what my PhD thesis title was. And then I'm going to talk a little bit also about taking an emic view of the role of nomads in the polities of this period, which is what I've been doing in this postdoc I'm on now with Erez Ben Yosef, who's sort of the leading expert in Iron Age nomads here in Israel. Okay. Okay. All right, so my emphasis on emic perspectives in society and polity in the early Iron Age Levant is kind of coming from two things. One, the persistence of really etic perspectives, so outsider sort of non-indigenous perspectives in the archaeology of Israel. This is pretty much of the sort of orthodoxy here, you could say. And B, I've sort of embraced an emic approach in my research out of a desire to understand more how things were within the particular cultural context of early Iron Age Israel, rather than how we think things should be. Because I think that when we try to use a lot of our own concepts and values and notions to study, past cultural contexts, we're kind of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, if you like. And this is particularly important if you are looking at the archaeology of societies and polities like I am, because there can be a tendency, I think, in etic perspectives to take the archaeological record, and which is the square peg, and try to fit it into the round hole of our own preconceptions about how social and political relationships should look like when they're materialized. And when they're materialized, of course, is what we find when we do archaeology. So it's really about trying to make sure that we're asking the right, appropriate questions of our data that's sensitive to that data's embedded cultural context, particularly when we're looking at such an ancient situation like ancient Israel. And also, I think it just goes to the general importance of doing theory in archaeology. I recall a conversation with a senior archaeologist in Israel once, actually an American. I won't say who it is, but I remember him saying to me, well, yes, theory is all very well and good, and I support, the writing of theory, but I found that it's really best to approach things from a common sense approach, were his words. Now, in my view, there is really no such thing as a common sense approach to trying to draw information about ancient polity, ancient society, ancient economics, ancient culture out of the archaeological record, because it really is, I think, very important to adjust our thinking to the context that we're actually looking at. To kind of explain the historical background to what I'm going to talk about today, I decided to basically squash it all down into a representation through these two very important books. So you have here on the left Edward Said's seminal volume Orientalism, and Elman Service's Primitive Social Organization, one of the classics of social evolutionist thought, and particularly neo-evolutionist thought that came about after the Second World War. And I'm wary, of course, of the fact that I'm speaking here at the University of Michigan, which was one of the other bastions of social evolutionism in the 60s and 70s, alongside Columbia University, where Service worked. So why is Orientalism important? Well, first of all, Said, in his thesis presenting Orientalism, didn't really talk about the Western gaze and the kind of formation of Orientalist biases and cultural constructs to do with archaeology. He was mostly talking about literature, but he did talk a bit about archaeology. And either way, I think it's important to keep what Said was talking about in mind, because there really is, I think, a persistent history of thought in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, and particularly in Israel, that is basically Orientalist. So what you have is a tendency to see the historical and archaeological records really through a Western lens of what social and political organization ought to look like, rather than going from the sort of an internal cultural perspective of the ancient Near East. Service, on the other hand, is a little bit different in that what he was trying to apply was a universal model for how societies evolved, that wasn't not dependent on any one particular cultural context. But the interesting thing is that he kind of inherited and reproduced what I would consider a very Orientalist perspective on tribes, in that he saw tribes as one of the sort of lesser evolved statuses of a particular society on its way to becoming a state, which for him was the sort of pinnacle of social organization, which is really sort of ironic from the perspective of ancient Near Eastern studies, because tribes have persistently been absolutely fundamental to ancient Near Eastern and even more modern Near Eastern social organization. And as I'll talk a bit about in a moment, not something that's necessarily, dichotomous with state, with a level of organization that is recognized with the state. But to sort of tack back to Said and Orientalism for a moment, even the notion of the state is something that's very much a product of the Western gaze, because of course, the state is very much a Western experience of political organization that has been, I would argue, really retrojected back onto parts of the ancient world, and particularly the Near East. Both of them really Orientalism and the idea of evolutionism have to do also, I think we should recognize, in both archaeology and anthropology, a tendency to want to study the ancient world from a quote-unquote scientific point of view, which usually has, I think, meant ignoring local context and embedded cultural values, and trying to apply something that, its proponents would consider to be objective, but has often, I think, really been based on just the particular experience of the West. All right, so as I said, my work has really reacted against an emic approach to society and polity in the archaeology of ancient Israel, and I want to boil it down to a couple of pillars that are important to this emic approach that I'm reacting against. The first is a central assumption that when you get a kingdom, which is the most common form of high-level polity organization in the Near East, what you have is a state, okay? And that if you have a state, therefore what you must have are all the elements and attributes of a state. So you have political centralization and control by a small group of elites at the very top, and those elites are supported by a particular administrative organization that, from our perspective, we would call bureaucracy. So you have specialists who are working in specialist offices according to specialist roles with very particular technical skills by which they become qualified to do those roles, and they sort of administer throughout the particular polity the will of the elite group. And perhaps more importantly for what I'm talking about today, the idea is that the state level of control, including the bureaucracy, really kind of stand above and cancel out the local power or supersede the local power of a kinship-based organization, all the way from families up to larger pre-modern social organizations like tribes. Now, there are a few more material markers in this etic approach that we could point to, but really one of the most overriding, and for me is one of the most important to actually deal with, is the presence of monumental architecture. Now, what exactly constitutes monumental architecture is, I think, a question that's often overlooked, but we'll go with the concept for the time being. And in the archaeology of Israel, I found that monumental architecture often is kind of used coterminously or interchangeably with the idea of a public building. And of course, that's something, again, that's inherent in the idea of a state, is that you have a public sphere of life in which the government and the bureaucracy operates, and a private sphere of life. And so in order for the public sphere of life and bureaucratic administration to operate, you have to have dedicated public infrastructure, if you like, which in archaeology you usually just think of in terms of this idea of public buildings. Monumentality, on the other hand, tends to be seen as something by which this state level of control and the elites imposed their will over the local population throughout the landscape that the state actually occupied. So what you tend to get is something that looks a lot like the work of Bruce Trigger, who did some of the most seminal work on monumental architecture from within the sort of processual school of thought a few decades ago. And his thinking is very, very much influential in the archaeology of Israel, even if he's not actually cited. Now, this last point is a bit more relevant to the second part of the talk, and I'll come back to this. But one of the most fundamental but usually overlooked dichotomies in the archaeology of Israel is a view that when societies move from a nomadic to a sedentarized state, that goes along with the move from this sort of more kinship-based organization to an evolved public state-based organization. And the two don't sort of mix or intermingle. So conversely with that, you have this assumption that nomadic groups, or even, mixed groups of settled and nomadic peoples, that they don't form states, that nomadism is sort of an inherently socially unevolved form of life. And on the more practical side, in Near Eastern studies, this has tended to go along with a view that nomads are not particularly important historical actors. At least this is the case in a lot of older work, not so much more recently. And if you're talking about archaeology in Israel, you tend to get this assumption that nomads in the ancient world really can be kind of reflected ethnographically in nomads today, which in Israel and other countries like Jordan really means the modern Bedouin, who are really pretty marginal to the settled life of these countries. All right, now to actually focus in on the early kingdom of Israel, I'm aware that obviously not everybody is going to necessarily know what this is, so I want to give a quick summary of what I'm talking about. So the early kingdom of Israel, or what it's often called in the literature, the United Monarchy, which is a purely modern term, was a kingdom that ruled over much of what is now Israel and the West Bank in the 10th century. And the two famous monarchs of this kingdom are, of course, the biblical kings David and Solomon. We don't know exactly when they ruled, roughly over a 75-80 period in the 10th century BC. The only source for their rule is the Hebrew Bible. With one exception that I'll talk about in a moment, they're not mentioned in any other Near Eastern source. And more specifically, the Hebrew Bible is our only source for what this kingdom was actually like. Archaeologically, there's been a big debate since the mid-90s about which archaeological period covers the time of David and Solomon. Traditionally, it was considered to be the Iron Age II-A, and the earlier period, the Iron Age I, ended in 1000, around about the time of the beginning of David's rule. More recently, other archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein, who was a scholar for many years, recently retired here at Tel Aviv University, suggested that actually this Iron I period continued on until the end of the 10th century. And this has had particular implications because usually scholars have only seen these common material signs of state formation, like monumentality in public buildings, in the Iron Age II-A and not in the Iron I. So if the Iron I didn't begin until after David and Solomon ruled, then according to this logic, they can't have been a state. That's a very summary version of what is proved to be a very complex argument. But okay, so if we're taking an Emic approach, how do we actually know what the internal concepts and values that ancient Israelites actually used to order their social and political worlds? Well, the thing about Emic perspectives is, of course, that you have to have some direct insight, and that generally comes from texts. It's a very difficult thing to, tease out of purely the archaeological record. Fortunately, in the Near East, we have the advantage of having a huge number of texts that actually speak to this, even if not always in the most direct way. But particularly if you're talking about Bronze Age kingdoms in the ancient Near East, we're quite lucky because we have huge caches of cuneiform tablets that have been preserved in many cities throughout the Near East that give us very good insight into the sort of day-to-day goings on and the language of that was used to sort of order the social world of these kingdoms. And what we see broadly in texts from the Bronze Age Near East is a tendency to see social organization in terms of the household. So you have the household at the most basic practical level that everybody lives in, but you also see the household used as the actual metaphor for social organization at levels above the local household. This extends all the way up even to kingdoms, which were literally seen as one great household in which the king, the position of the king basically was owed to the fact that the king was like the father of this one great household. It's a little bit more complicated than that because the one great household of the king incorporates many other households, all the way again, through the larger and smaller social units, all the way down to the individual local household. What these other, actually, sorry, I'll get to that in a moment. But so this is something that was most originally articulated most directly through an analysis of texts from the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit, which is on the coast of Syria. This was done by David Sloan, an archaeologist at the University of Chicago, and he published this in his 2001 volume called The House of the Fathers, Fact and Symbol. And Sloan, looking at texts from Ugarit as well as other places, saw the importance of the household as the organizing principle of ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, and particularly of household language and household ideas of organization in terms of the structure of these polities. So you'd have a situation where everyone basically was considered a son or a servant, literally, of the king's household, whether or not they were an immediate member of the king's court or they were just a local farmer living in a far-flung village. And as you go down from the king down to the local people, you see this series of father-son, father-daughter, father-servant relationships that structure the kingdom in a sort of pyramidal hierarchy, if you like. Now, when we get into the Iron Age, we see this persisting, and we particularly see it within the biblical texts, the books of Samuel and Kings that describe David and Solomon's kingdom. And it even shows up on the one widely accepted mention of David's name appearing in an ancient Near Eastern text, which is this text, the Tel Dan stele, which is from Tel Dan, up in the north of Israel, very close to a site where I've been working for the last few years, Tel Avel Beit Macha. And although there's been a bit of debate, this stele is generally considered a victory stele that was planted at Tel Dan by King Hazael of Damascus after a major campaign he conducted into the southern Levant in the 9th century. And he mentions there slaying a king of the house of David, which is a very good illustration of how David's kingdom, at this point, didn't incorporate all of Israel, but was considered to be literally the household of the dynastic founder. So as I said, you have this sort of structure of households within households that was described by Sloan. What the lower level household social units were in each particular polity could differ a little bit. In Israel, you're talking about tribes. Now, of course, the famous tribe of Judah, the tribes of Issachar, Manasseh, all those tribes that you find in the biblical text are sort of the lower level social units that make up the fundamental building blocks of this kingdom. And when you have this situation where you have a household organization with the king as the father, Sloan recognized that this was the same as a type of social organization called patrimonialism that was described by the early 20th century German sociologist Max Weber. So that's where we get the term patrimonialism from. And as I'll talk about in a little while, this has to do also with the economic organization of the kingdom. So what are the main implications of this? Well, as I've discussed in a recent article, I think that we can't really describe these ancient states as these ancient kingdoms as states. We don't really see evidence of a bureaucracy. The state doesn't really have its own identity. What we're really talking about are these extended networks, and the network is made up of these larger and smaller building blocks of local household units that go all the way up to the king. So instead of local kinship units like tribes becoming sort of superseded, they remain very important to the structure of the kingdom, which is something that my colleague who works in Jordan, Oyster and LaBianca has recently described as polycentrism. So rather than a centralization of power, you actually get more this sort of web of different local powers that come together to form one kingdom. And the next question really then beyond this is, what are there any archaeological indicators of a patrimonial kingdom? And in my view, if you accept this model, it becomes frankly much more difficult to find consistent, predictable archaeological indicators. Certainly you can't use anything like the checklist approach that's often used in processual archaeology of states, mostly because in a patrimonial model, authority and power really rests at an interpersonal level. It's not something that it relies upon purely material symbols. Sorry. On top of that fact, again, if we're embracing an emic approach and we're really only going by, what are the actual concepts that our ancient subjects used, we can ask, should we really apply any archaeological markers that aren't alluded to somehow in these texts that we're using? And in the Hebrew Bible, and I would argue in ancient Near Eastern texts more broadly, I see a lack of any indication that monumental architecture was specifically used to impose a political will on a population at a local level. So I'm just going to, for time reasons, skip over that first example, and I'm going to talk here about Palace 6000 from Megiddo. Now, why this particular site? Well, first of all, Megiddo is a site that is mentioned in some important places in the biblical text related to Solomon's reign. First, it mentions that Solomon conducted some sort of building activity there. We don't know what. And second of all, it mentions that Megiddo was part of one of the sort of local provinces that Solomon divided his kingdom into. And Palace 6000 is a building that has traditionally been considered a sort of public building par excellence from Solomon's reign. As I said, there's been a lot of chronological arguments in Israel, so not all would necessarily consider this building to be, this building dates from the Iron Age II-A, but not all would now necessarily consider the Iron Age II-A to date to the reign of Solomon. Some would consider it to be later. But if you go by the traditional sort of biblical archaeology view of this building that we got from individuals such as Yigal Yadin, who was the Israeli archaeologist who actually excavated most of this structure, this is a big ashlar building that's much bigger than any domestic house, and therefore is exactly the kind of thing that should be referred to as a public building and must have played some bureaucratic administrative role in the organization of this local province that might have been based at Megiddo. The problem is when you actually look at what was found in this building, it's really very hard to conclude that it was a building that was for a dedicated, specific administrative purpose. And in fact, it clearly had a domestic function, at least in part. We know this from one room that was found with clay ovens, with cooking pots, with serving vessels. And then along the back row of rooms in the building towards the top of the picture, there was a series of rooms that were full of storage jars. You can see some from one of the few good pictures from Yadin's excavation there on the right-hand side. And so this to me looks like a very good example of a patrimonial estate rather than a bureaucratic building, because what you would have is a local individual maybe living in a large house who actually sort of governed the area around him like a large estate. So he had the agricultural products of his own land or of other households that were underneath him sort of collected together into his estate, from where they could be redistributed to do to enact programs either that he wanted to put in place or that were part of the sort of program around the kingdom that the king wanted to put in place. So it's sort of a local big man, if you like, who was a local landholder who governed other landholders and worked on behalf of the king as part of this this larger network that the king had. And this goes together very well, I would say, with the biblical text, because in the biblical text, it names the local governor that Solomon had in Megiddo, and it actually tells us that it was a close personal member of Solomon's sort of inner circle, who was the brother of one of Solomon's own sort of patrimonial courtiers, if you like. Okay, now to move on to the nomadism side for the rest of this lecture. So what I've talked about so far is really only half of the picture when we're looking at society and politics in the early Iron Age Levant, because I've only talked about things from the point of view of the settled. But what about the unsettled? Well, to illustrate this, I'm going to look at the early Iron Age kingdom of Edom, which is one of Israel's neighbors, in this case, sort of to the south. Which is what I've been working on with Erez Ben Yosef in my postdoc. Now, Edom first shows up in some Egyptian inscriptions from the late Bronze Age, including at least one where it's associated with a group called the Shasu, who were, it appears, nomadic groups in the area of what is now Jordan and southern Israel that gave the Egyptians trouble on some occasions, but on some occasions the Egyptians were also sort of friendly to them and even allowed them to come into the delta with their flocks. Aside from the Hebrew Bible, the term Edom then doesn't appear until much later, all the way until the late Iron Age, in this case the 8th century. So in the period after we're talking about, when it appears in inscriptions from the Assyrian and Babylonian empires as they were encroaching into this area. And archaeologically, it was thought for a long time, particularly on the basis of excavations that were done in Jordan in the 60s, that Edom didn't really exist again until this period, because this was the earliest that any settlement site in Egypt dated to was the 8th century. And so it was thought that even though the Hebrew Bible talks about the kingdom of Edom and even talks about it existing back in the days of David and Solomon, that this can't have been historical, that it must have been that this kingdom of Edom didn't form until a few centuries later, because this is the earliest that we had archaeology from Edom. So what we had then, I should say also, was a gap in the time of David and Solomon in the early Iron Age that seemed to be unfilled. So what fills that gap then? Well, nomads, it appears. Now, nomads, there's three big reasons why nomads tend to get left out as historical actors and agents in the Near East, and particularly in Israel. The first one is that typically nomads are very difficult to detect, especially small nomadic groups. They don't really leave easily recoverable remains. As I've said, there's also the factor that social and political theory in archaeology has been influenced by this Orientalist and very Eurocentric view, which partly had to do with the fact that when Western travelers started coming into the Near East in mass in the 19th century, what they encountered were a lot of nomadic groups that were often very hostile and antagonistic with the Ottoman government and the local Ottoman administration. So it's, in a way, it's no surprise that they would form this view that nomads and Bedouin were these sort of romantic, highly independent groups that didn't really mix in with settled states, as it were. We also tend to get a view that nomads and settled societies really kept apart and lived very separate lives in the ancient Near East, particularly, well, even in the case where they actually came together in the same polity. This is really the product of the work of Michael Roughton, a University of Chicago archaeologist, who published a lot on nomads in the ancient Near East in the 70s and 80s. And particularly, he pointed to the case of Mari, a kingdom in the Middle Bronze Age that included both settled and nomadic components. But he saw Mari as a good example of what he called a dimorphic polity, where you had both a nomadic and an urban population, but they sort of existed in tandem but without mixing, and kept to their own sort of internal social structures. All right, now what's prompted new thinking about Edom and why we should consider it nomadic in the early Iron Age? Well, it really has to do with two sites. Sorry, let me go back to my map here. You'll see down the bottom these two sites, the Wadi Fainan, which is in Jordan, and Timnah, which is in Israel. And this is a view over Chibet en Nachas, which is a site in the Wadi Fainan that was excavated for many years by Tom Levy on behalf of the University of California at San Diego. And what Levy and his team found at Chibet en Nachas, as well as at a few other sites, was a huge industry of copper mining and copper production, so the smelting process to actually make copper ingots, that dated to the early Iron Age. So in this case, we're talking the 12th century BC, all the way through to the 9th century BC, when it seems to have stopped. And this is a huge undertaking that left these large slag mounds all over the site of copper slag from the smelting process. And you can see down the bottom left-hand corner an excavation through one of these mounds. And this was very good from an archaeological, chronological perspective, because these slag mounds produced a lot of radiocarbon dates that could be used to date when this industry existed. But what does this have to do with nomads? Well, in the Fainan, there is some architecture that goes along with these industries, but not that many. Just a few buildings that you see here, like this large fort that's over on the right-hand side of the picture. Buildings that might have been exclusively dedicated to the copper production process, or to defending the area against people who might want to come and take control of this industry for themselves. What we don't have is a big settlement, and, lots of domestic remains of people who are actually conducting this industry. What's more likely is that this industry was conducted by nomadic Edomites living in the area who would come down into Fainan, which is in the lowlands of Jordan, seasonally with their flocks and conduct the copper mining while they were down there. Unfortunately, Levy's team found a direct indication of this population at this site. This is called Wadi Fidan 40. Wadi Fidan is another nearby wadi in the Fainan system, and here they excavated a series of graves of what appeared to be the nomadic population that was actually responsible for this industry. And again, the cemetery is not associated with any settlement, and analysis of some of the bones actually showed that some of these people who were buried in this cemetery actually were directly involved in the copper production process, and it left a chemical trace on their bones. Basically, the same story pertains at Timnah in Israel, which Erez Ben Yosef has been excavating since 2012. Also a large copper mining and smelting area. What you see here is a view of, on the upper left of the picture, is a hill that is known as Site 34, sometimes known as Slaves Hill. And this was the main copper production site in the Timnah area in the early Iron Age, so from the 12th century to the 9th century. And again, this was made possible by radiocarbon dates from slag mounds and other installations and copper working areas around the site. Earlier excavations in Timnah that were conducted by Benno Rothenberg, who's one of the fathers of archaeometallurgy many decades ago, he concluded that the copper mining in the region was really the responsibility of the Egyptians, because we know that the Egyptians had a presence in the area in the 13th century. The best evidence is this temple to the goddess Hathor that's nearby to Slaves Hill. But again, the copper mining really dates to the early Iron Age, and we see even less in the way of buildings here at Timnah. There's really only some evidence of a defensive structure that surrounded Site 34, and that's about it. So again, we must be dealing with nomads. But it's important to emphasize that what we see here is we only get a clue to them from the remains of these this copper production, not from their actual domestic life in the area around. We just don't really find, except for a few scraps here and there, any signs of their camps, their tents, anything like that. And this also, I should add, was clearly a very, very well organized operation. These Edomites mined huge amounts of copper and produced it into copper that was traded all throughout the Near East. We've seen it testing of objects from Egypt, like this one from the 21st dynasty, all the way to Greece from the early Iron Age, have shown that the copper came from the Fainan and Timnah area. On top of that, it was an operation that required water to be brought from faraway sources, wood to be brought in from faraway sources, because these were areas that were not very boreal. They didn't have much in the way of trees to supply this copper production. The Edomites also needed to have a system to bring food for the miners and copper workers from afar. And because the preservation in Timnah in particular is so good, being in a desert area, a lot of animal and plant remains have been found in these sites, including fish remains that came as far away as the Mediterranean. And speaking of things coming from as far away as the Mediterranean, one of the very few examples of the famous Phoenician purple dyed textile was found at Timna in a context dating to the 10th century BC. So this was a polity that was very well organized in terms of this copper industry, had very far away long distance trade contacts. So this was not something that was some marginal group of nomads just wandering around the desert. And I should add also that in this period, the early Iron Age, the Fainan and Timna were the two main copper sources for copper in the Eastern Iron Age. Cyprus had been the main source back in the late Bronze Age, but that had ended in the 13th century, and so Timna and Fainan were had the sort of monopoly over copper in this period. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, for one thing, here we have a case of partial invisibility of nomads, but not through the remains of most of their life and their activities, only through the remains of one particular industry. And this highlights the fact that except for rare exceptional cases like this, by and large, nomads remain very difficult to find in the archaeology. But the more important implication is what Erez in his publications has referred to as an architectural bias. So the tendency of archaeologists working in the Levant to only focus on the remains of settled populations when they're looking for evidence of social complexity and how it developed. But what the case of the Fainan and Timna indicate is that you could have a highly complex society, but without these typical archaeological markers like monumentality in particular. And the best way to sum it up is through this quote by Pekka Hamalainen, who's a scholar at the University of Oxford who's worked on nomads in North America, that nomads are kind of like the dark matter of history. They're this invisible substance that has a clear pull on complex societies and historical goings on in their region, but which through most of our techniques of data collection are very difficult to find. Moreover, this picture that we have from the Fainan and Timna really, I think, fits well with what we know about nomads in the Near East, because what we tend to see in the Near East is you do have some ancient nomadic polities, but what we see not so much in places like Mari is not so much dimorphism, so a strict separation between the urban and the nomadic who are living together, but polymorphism, so a sort of cacophonous mix of settled and nomadic populations, or even we know from the texts from Mari, populations who could include both settled components, nomadic components, or who could shift between a sedentary and nomadic lifestyle. And one of the things that Michael Roughton didn't know about when he was writing about Mari earlier was something that was only discovered by the team who were publishing the text from Mari in the 80s, which was that King Zimri Lim, who was the king we know most about from Mari, actually belonged to one of the large tribal polities within the kingdom of Mari that was mostly nomadic. So this just shows you that there wasn't really a strict separation between the settled and nomadic in Mari. And moreover, I should add that I think in the Hebrew Bible and more generally in the ancient Near East, even though we have a recognition in texts of differences between the settled and nomadic lifestyle, what we don't really see is any inherent idea that nomads are somehow less capable of what we would call social complexity than settled populations were. So I'll just finish quickly by talking about circling back to Israel. Erez and I are very interested in the possibility of nomadic populations being part of David and Solomon's kingdom. Generally in Israel, they're very difficult to find, but one area where we might have them is here in the region around Tel El Hesi in southwestern Israel. And this actually connects quite a bit to work that Kara has done in her postgraduate study on looking at animal remains from the sites in this region. And what the team working on this region have found is that in the early Iron Age, the Iron I and the Iron II-A, this region was very, very unsettled. You don't see settlement from this period across most of the landscape, except mostly at these two sites, Tel El Hesi and Chebet Sumeli. And what they found at Chebet Sumeli in particular is an administrative building, well, a building of some sort, dating from the Iron Age II-A, that might have been the center of a sort of a local patrimonial estate or polity within the kingdom that mostly governed nomads, because what they found there was a little bit of the way in domestic remains. So you see, ovens, but not much in the way of storage of agricultural goods. Instead, what they see there is a lot of animal bones from sheep and goat, the typical, and cattle too. I think maybe Kara can correct me. That were probably herded by pastoralists living in this area. So this might be one case of a nomadic population showing up through the deliveries that they made of animals to a sort of little administrative center over there at Kiryat Sumeli. But that's still a work in progress. It's still something I'm thinking about. So that's about the end of it there. I've probably run a bit over time. Sorry about that. But here's some basic bibliography of what I've been talking about today. And if anyone wants to have any questions beyond today about it, or want to get any publications, they can feel free to write to me or find me on academia. So that's it for now. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zach. And I will let people, if you have any questions, to utilize the Q&A function should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I'll give people a few seconds to quickly type out their questions. Yeah, I felt honored to see Hesi and Sumeli up there. I will note that the article touching on those animal remains is under review, so hopefully it'll be out soon.
Stay tuned.
Yes, stay tuned, absolutely. I guess as we wait for questions, I did have a quick question, kind of more touching on the beginning of your talk. Maybe this is more of a broad epistemological thought, but how do you find, especially when working with nomads, dealing with this architectural bias, as you noted, but also kind of working at the nexus of, biblical, classical, Near Eastern scholarship, and solidifying like that Emic anthropological theory when there's so many different discussions happening at different levels, and often those discussions aren't, pushing forward into, 2021.
Yeah, I guess it's just about sort of looking at all the different evidence and all the different theoretical perspectives and trying to nail down what you find is the best explanation for it. But I think a lot of it really is about trying to bust open these dichotomies that scholars have worked in for many years, that, try to sort of separate settled and nomadic, or complex and non-complex. Yeah, so a lot of it, I think, is trying to expose the actual, use an overused term, the complexity of life and political organization in the ancient Near East. And also, particularly in talking about the nomads, one of the things that's struck me working on this is that the view that's taken in Israel, not only being kind of out of whack with the evidence in the ancient Near East, is that it also doesn't make much sense when we look at the history of nomadic polities in world archaeology. Is if you look at something like the empire of Genghis Khan, that was a very rapidly formed, very powerful, nomadically based empire that also there's very little archaeological evidence for. Only in recent years have archaeologists working in Mongolia actually found, I think, some scratchy remains of what might have been the capital from the rulers who came after Genghis Khan. But if that's not a good example of the historical influence that nomads can have, I don't know what is. But there's other examples on top of that.
No, absolutely. And the bias of, where we have been excavating, what we've been looking at, and you're completely right. Nomads are much harder to detect in the archaeological record, but aren't impossible. And I think especially when we're looking at the Iron Age, that kind of tribal nomadic mentality is something that was easy to plug into, and thinking of forming these kind of state-like societies. Oh, and we do have a question. Okay, Dr. Mike Galati asked, I think your model minus the nomads can be extended to the Mycenaean states. The linear B tablets at Pylos preserve references to titles and social structures, the demos, for example, that seem to predate the palace and are perhaps tribal or at least local, i.e. bottom up versus top down. The palace bureaucracy and economy seems to be overlaid on this earlier system and depend on it, and also seems to depend on reciprocal exchanges that likewise predate the palace. Might nomads and settled folks in the Near East have interacted similarly? Are there hints of earlier social systems and reciprocal obligations preserved in Near Eastern texts?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I'm interested in Mycenaean state because although it's a bit beyond my area of expertise from what I've read, there also seems to be some evidence that it functioned in this sort of patrimonial and network-based model. So yeah, it's something that I'm hoping to look into a bit further in the future. As far as the earlier texts go, I would say that this basic setup is the case if you go back to Mesopotamia in the early Bronze period. If you really want to go back earlier, the best indications come from the third dynasty of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. Stephen Garfinkel, who's a scholar at the University of Eastern Washington, I think, has also looked at the Earthly state, or the Earthly kingdom, I should say, and come to the conclusion that it's patrimonial. And on top of that, even if you want to go a bit later, patrimonialism has also been used to describe the Hittite state in ancient Anatolia. So, yeah, I mean, I think probably the issue when you get back to really early Mesopotamian texts is the fact that they're maybe just not quite so detailed. But I think that, it makes sense that this basic sort of household-based social organization model was sort of, for lack of a better word, primordial to the ancient Near East.
Notice I was unmuted. And then as a follow-up question to Mike's question, I would observe that in the first millennium Greek context, Aristotle makes an analogy between the state and the household. Most people have looked at this in the Athenian context, but I think it might be more applicable to the context of the kingdom of Macedon.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, I remember one of the, something that I learned back as an undergrad taking courses on ancient Athens is, of course, our word economy has its root in the words oikos, and even in the heyday of the Athenian polity, they thought of the organization and the management of the polity as an oikos, as a household, which just shows you that there's the persistence of this mode of organization, even when we get to ancient Greece, which we tend to think of as the kind of starting point of the Western social and political tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if there are no more questions, I see that we're right on time. I want to thank you again, Zach. This was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for calling in from across the world. And
My pleasure.
yeah, and everybody who has attended, thank you for, this was a very well attended talk, and we hope to see you next week, same time, same place. Thank you, everybody.